Somewhere deep in your soul, there is a weight you were never meant to carry. You've tried to be strong. You've tried to fix it, manage it, explain it, survive it. Night after night, it follows you into silence. Morning after morning, it wakes up before you do. And today, God is asking you one simple, terrifying, freeing thing: let go. We live in a world that teaches us to hold tighter, hold on to control, hold on to fear, hold on to what we know, even when what we know is breaking us. But faith has never grown in clenched fists. Faith is born when the hands finally open. I have seen people who carried burdens so heavy they bent their backs and dimmed their eyes. They carried guilt from yesterday, fear from tomorrow, and pain from today all at once. They said, "I'll trust God when I understand," not realizing that understanding comes after surrender, not before. God has never asked you to figure it out. He has only asked you to trust Him with it. There was a man who once stood at the edge of his life falling apart. The doctors had done all they could do. The money was gone. The friends had faded. He prayed prayers that felt like they hit the ceiling and fell back down. One night, exhausted and empty, he whispered, "God, I can't do this anymore." And for the first time, that wasn't a complaint. It was a surrender. He stopped fighting God and started falling into Him. The situation didn't change overnight, but something else did. Peace entered the room before the miracle ever arrived. That is how God works. He doesn't always remove the storm first. Sometimes He quiets the heart so you can survive the storm. We want God to take away the impossible, but first He wants us to let go of the illusion that we were ever in control. You see, the impossible is God's territory. The moment you reach the end of your strength is the moment you step onto holy ground. When Moses stood before the sea with an army behind him and no escape ahead, he had no plan, he had no strategy. All he had was obedience. And when he stepped forward, God made a way where there was no way. The sea didn't part because Moses was strong. It parted because God is faithful. Some of you are standing at your own sea today. A marriage that feels beyond repair. A sickness that refuses to leave. A child who has walked far from God. A past mistake that keeps haunting your future. You've tried everything you know to do, and nothing has worked. That's not the end. That's the beginning. That's the moment when God steps in and says, "No, let me show you what I can do." Letting go does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop carrying what was never meant for your shoulders. Jesus never promised a life without trouble, but He did promise a life upheld by His presence. He said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Not advice, not explanations. Rest. We struggle with letting go because we are afraid of what might happen if we do. We think if we release it, everything will fall apart. But what if the opposite is true? What if things have been falling apart because you've been holding on too tightly? What if God has been waiting for you to loosen your grip so He can move? I once spoke with a woman who carried unforgiveness like a chain around her heart. Years had passed, but the wound still felt fresh. She said, "If I forgive, they win." But bitterness had already won. It stole her joy, her peace, her sleep. The day she finally said, "God, I release this to you," she didn't feel weak. She felt free. Forgiveness didn't change the past, but it changed her future. That is the power of letting go. God does not waste pain. He redeems it. The very thing that feels impossible in your life right now may become the testimony that strengthens someone else tomorrow. But that transformation begins when you trust God with the outcome. Faith is not denying reality. Faith is declaring that God is greater than reality. It is saying, "I don't see the answer, but I know the answerer. I don't know the way, but I know the way." When you let go, you are not stepping into darkness. You are stepping into the hands of a God who sees the end from the beginning. Some of you have been praying for a breakthrough while still gripping the burden. You've been asking God to move while refusing to move your heart into surrender. Today, God is closer than you think. He is not asking for your perfection. He is asking for your trust. Let go of the shame that says you are too far gone. Let go of the fear that says it will never change. Let go of the lie that you are alone. God specializes in impossibilities. He turns graves into gardens, crosses into crowns, and endings into beginnings. There will be moments when letting go feels like falling. But listen carefully. You will not fall past the grace of God. Underneath you are everlasting arms. When you finally release what you cannot fix, you make room for God to do what only He can do. One day, you will look back on this season and realize it was not the breaking of you. It was the building of your faith. The tears you cried were counted. The prayers you whispered were heard. The waiting was not wasted. So today, right where you are, open your hands. In your heart say, God, I trust you with this. Not because you understand, but because He is God. Not because it is easy, but because He is faithful. Let go. God will take care of the impossible. Letting go is one of the hardest things the human heart is ever asked to do. From the moment we face uncertainty, our instinct is to grip tighter, to hold on to control, as if our strength alone can shape the outcome. We believe that if we just try harder, think longer, or worry more, somehow we can protect ourselves from pain. Yet faith has never flourished in hands that refuse to open. It is born in surrender, in the quiet moment when a person finally admits that control was never theirs to begin with. Clenched fists are a picture of fear. They reveal a heart that is bracing for loss, disappointment, or failure. We hold tightly to plans, relationships, and expectations because letting go feels like stepping into the unknown. But the unknown to us is not unknown to God. When the hands remain closed, there is no room to receive what God desires to place there. Faith requires an open posture, a willingness to release what feels familiar so something greater can be received. Throughout life, people carry burdens that slowly exhaust the soul. They carry regret from past mistakes, anxiety over tomorrow, and the pressure to appear strong in front of others. These weights were never meant to be carried alone. God invites His children not to manage their burdens, but to surrender them. Letting go does not mean giving up responsibility. It means releasing the false belief that everything depends on human effort. When a person acknowledges their limits, they make room for divine strength to enter. There is a powerful shift that happens when someone stops fighting and starts trusting. The moment the heart loosens its grip, peace begins to flow in. Not because circumstances have changed, but because the source of hope has changed. Control says, I must handle this. Faith says, God is able. That quiet exchange transforms fear into confidence and restlessness into calm. God's power is not activated by striving, but by surrender. Many struggle with letting go because they equate it with weakness. They fear it means defeat or failure. In truth, it is an act of courage. It takes strength to admit dependence on God in a world that praises self-sufficiency. Faith declares that human effort has limits, but God's power does not. The release of control is not the end of action. It is the beginning of trust that God is already at work beyond what can be seen. When the heart opens, God fills it with what it cannot produce on its own. He replaces anxiety with peace, confusion with clarity, and despair with hope. Closed hands cannot receive grace, but open hands invite it. This is why surrender becomes the doorway to God's power. The more tightly a person clings to fear, the less space there is for faith to grow. But when fear is released, faith takes root and begins to rise. Faith does not demand explanations before it trusts. It rests in the character of God rather than the certainty of outcomes. Letting go shifts the focus from personal ability to divine faithfulness. It acknowledges that God sees what is hidden, understands what is confusing, and holds what feels fragile. In that release, The heart learns that it was never holding life together in the first place, and that God has been steady all along. The impossible often feels like a wall standing directly in front of the soul, unmoving and unbreakable. People spend years pressing against it, searching for cracks, looking for a way through with their own strength. They exhaust themselves trying to solve what cannot be solved, fix what cannot be fixed, and change what refuses to change. The weight of the impossible grows heavier with every failed attempt until hope begins to feel fragile and distant. Yet the impossible is not a sign of abandonment. It is an invitation into deeper trust. Human strength has limits, even when driven by determination and good intentions. There comes a moment when effort reaches its edge, and no amount of planning or perseverance can push the situation forward. That moment often feels like defeat, but in reality it is a threshold. It marks the place where human ability steps aside and God's intervention begins to move. The impossible exposes the truth that reliance on personal strength can only go so far, and that true help must come from beyond oneself. Many resist this truth because admitting weakness feels uncomfortable. Society teaches that strength means independence, that asking for help is failure, and that endurance alone defines character. But God's power is revealed not through self-sufficiency, but through dependence. When human strength fades, pride loosens its grip, and the heart becomes open to divine direction. The impossible strips away illusions of control and reminds the soul of its need for God. Throughout life, people encounter moments that force them to confront their limitations. A diagnosis that cannot be reversed, a relationship that seems beyond repair, a door that refuses to open no matter how hard it is pushed. These moments feel unfair and overwhelming, yet they serve a sacred purpose. They bring the heart to a place where it must choose between despair and trust. The impossible becomes the setting where faith is either surrendered or strengthened. God often waits until human strength has reached its end before he moves, not to cause pain, but to reveal his power more clearly. When solutions disappear, faith learns to stand alone. In that place, prayers change from demands into surrender, and from desperation into hope. The soul begins to understand that God is not limited by circumstances, time, or human logic. What feels final to a person is simply a beginning to him. The impossible also teaches patience, shaping character in ways comfort never could. It refines motives and deepens humility. When strength fails, the heart learns to listen rather than strive, to trust rather than control. God's intervention often unfolds in ways that cannot be predicted or explained, reminding the soul that his ways are higher and his plans greater. Miracles are not always loud or immediate. Sometimes God intervenes quietly, restoring peace before changing circumstances. Sometimes he strengthens the heart before removing the burden. In every case, the impossible becomes the stage upon which God reveals his faithfulness. What human effort cannot achieve, divine power accomplishes with purpose and precision. The end of human strength is not a place of abandonment, but a place of encounter. It is where faith stops leaning on effort and begins resting in God's ability. The impossible does not exist to crush hope, but to redirect it toward the one who is able to do far more than the human mind can imagine. Peace is often misunderstood as the reward that comes after everything has been fixed. Many believe it arrives only when the problem is solved, the burden is lifted, or the answer is clear. But true peace does not wait for circumstances to improve. It enters the heart long before the miracle appears, settling into the soul as a quiet assurance that God is present and in control. This kind of peace does not deny pain or ignore reality. It stands firm in the middle of uncertainty. When a person faces a situation that feels impossible, the first battle is rarely external. The greatest struggle takes place within the heart and mind. Fear begins to speak loudly, filling thoughts with worry and questions that have no easy answers. In this space, peace becomes the first sign that God is at work. It arrives not as a solution, but as a steady presence that guards the heart from being overwhelmed. This peace shifts the focus from what is feared to who is trusted. God often calms the inner storm before he stills the outer one. He knows that without peace, the heart cannot recognize his guidance or rest in his promises. Anxiety clouds judgment and weakens faith, but peace strengthens endurance and clarity. When peace takes root, it allows the soul to breathe again, to stand firm even when nothing around it has changed. This inner calm becomes evidence that God is closer than circumstances suggest. Many people search for peace in explanations, reassurance from others, or visible signs of progress. Yet peace given by God does not depend on understanding or confirmation. It flows from trust, not certainty. It is the confidence that God sees what is hidden, hears what is whispered in prayer, and holds what feels fragile. This peace does not eliminate questions, but it quiets the urgency to have every answer immediately. Before miracles unfold, hearts must be prepared to receive them. Peace prepares the heart by removing panic and replacing it with patience. It teaches the soul to wait without despair and to hope without demanding control. In this waiting, faith matures. It learns that God's timing is not delayed, and his silence is not absence. Peace becomes the anchor that keeps the heart steady while God works behind the scenes. This peace also protects the heart from discouragement. When outcomes remain uncertain and delays stretch longer than expected, peace acts as a shield against bitterness and doubt. It reminds the soul that God's faithfulness is not measured by speed, but by purpose. Even when prayers seem unanswered, peace testifies that God is still attentive and active. Peace does not mean passivity. It strengthens the heart to keep believing, praying, and trusting without being consumed by fear. It allows the soul to remain open rather than hardened by disappointment. In this way, peace becomes the soil in which miracles grow. Long before circumstances shift, the heart is transformed, strengthened, and aligned with God's will. When peace arrives before the miracle, it reveals something profound about God's character. It shows that he values the condition of the heart as much as the resolution of the situation. The miracle may change circumstances, but peace changes the person, ensuring that when the answer comes, the heart is ready to receive it with gratitude and faith. Fear, guilt, and the need for control often settle into the heart so quietly that they begin to feel normal. Over time, they shape decisions, influence relationships, and distort the way a person sees both themselves and God. What begins as self-protection slowly becomes a prison. Holding on to these emotions feels safer than releasing them because letting go requires trust. Yet it is this very grip that delays the freedom God is ready to give. Fear convinces the heart that the worst outcome is inevitable. It whispers that change is dangerous and that disappointment is unavoidable. When fear takes root, it narrows vision and weakens faith, causing the soul to focus on survival rather than hope. God does not lead his people through fear, but through trust. As long as fear is held tightly, faith struggles to grow. Releasing fear creates space for courage to rise and for God's promises to take hold. Guilt works differently, but its grip is just as strong. It ties the heart to past mistakes, replaying moments that cannot be changed. Guilt convinces a person that they are defined by their failures and disqualified from God's grace. This weight becomes heavier with time, draining joy and confidence. God offers forgiveness freely, but guilt refuses to let go of what God has already released. Until guilt is surrendered, the heart remains stuck in yesterday while God is calling it forward. Control often disguises itself as responsibility. It convinces people that if they manage every detail, anticipate every problem, and hold everything together, then nothing will fall apart. This burden leads to exhaustion and frustration because life was never meant to be controlled by human effort alone. God invites trust, not micromanagement. When control is released, the heart learns to rest in the truth that God is attentive, capable, and faithful. Holding on to these burdens creates a delay, not in God's willingness to act, but in the heart's readiness to receive freedom. God does not force release, He invites it. Freedom requires consent. The heart must be willing to release what has become familiar, even when it is painful. Fear, guilt, and control may feel secure, but they quietly steal peace and joy. Letting go is not an instant emotional shift. It is a decision repeated daily. Each time fear arises, it must be handed back to God. Each time guilt resurfaces, forgiveness must be accepted again. Each time the urge to control returns, trust must be reaffirmed. In this ongoing surrender, the heart gradually becomes lighter, freer, and more open to God's work. God's freedom does not arrive through force, but through trust. When the heart releases what it has been gripping, it becomes receptive to grace, healing, and renewal. Freedom flows where surrender lives. As fear loosens, courage grows. As guilt fades, identity is restored. As control is released, peace takes its place. God's desire has always been to lead His people out of bondage, but the first step is letting go of what binds the heart. Surrender is often misunderstood as giving up, as though trust in God means retreating from responsibility or accepting defeat. In reality, surrender requires more courage than resistance. It demands that a person face the truth about their limitations and acknowledge that some outcomes are beyond human control. Weakness hides behind self-reliance, but surrender stands boldly in faith, declaring that God is greater than human strength. The heart resists surrender because it threatens pride and challenges the need for independence. People are taught to stand on their own, to solve their own problems, and to prove their worth through effort, yet there are moments in life when effort reaches its limit. In those moments, surrender becomes a choice between despair and trust. Choosing surrender is not an escape. It is a deliberate act of faith that places confidence in God rather than in personal ability. Trusting God with outcomes means releasing the demand to understand every detail. It means accepting that God sees the full picture while the human perspective remains limited. This trust does not ignore reality. It acknowledges it while believing that God is actively working beyond what is visible. Surrender hands over the future, not because it is easy, but because God is faithful. There is a deep strength found in letting God handle what only He can control. When the heart stops striving for certainty, it becomes open to peace. Anxiety loses its power when trust takes its place. Surrender lifts the burden of having to predict every outcome or prevent every failure. It shifts the weight from fragile human shoulders to the steady hands of God. Many people hold tightly to outcome because they fear disappointment. They believe that if they surrender their expectations, they will be left vulnerable. Yet surrender does not remove hope, it purifies it. It transforms hope from a demand into a confident expectation rooted in God's character. This kind of hope remains steady even when circumstances are uncertain. Surrender also strengthens perseverance. When outcomes are entrusted to God, the heart is freed to focus on obedience rather than results. Faithfulness becomes the priority, not success as defined by human standards. This freedom allows the soul to move forward without being paralyzed by fear of failure or loss. Trust becomes an anchor, holding the heart steady through uncertainty. True surrender deepens relationship with God. It invites intimacy by acknowledging dependence and need. In this posture, prayer becomes honest and open rather than guarded or controlled. The heart learns to rest in God's presence, confident that He is attentive and compassionate. Surrender is not a one-time event, but a daily choice. Each day presents new opportunities to either reclaim control or reaffirm trust. With each act of surrender, Faith grows stronger and the heart becomes more resilient. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable when placed in God's hands. Surrender reveals that trusting God with outcomes is not weakness, but the strongest decision a heart can make. There comes a moment when words fall silent and the heart must answer the truth it has heard. This is that moment. Not a moment of pressure, but of invitation. Not a demand, but a gentle call from a God who has been patient with your struggle, attentive to your tears, and present through every season of uncertainty. After all the striving, all the holding on, all the silent battles fought in the dark, God is still here, waiting with open hands. You were never meant to live exhausted by fear, weighed down by guilt, or crushed under the burden of control. Those weights have shaped your days and stolen your rest, but they do not define your future. God sees more than the problem in front of you. He sees the purpose forming within you. He sees the strength that will rise when trust replaces fear and surrender replaces striving. Letting go does not mean the pain was insignificant or the journey unnecessary. It means you trust God enough to believe He can redeem what hurt you. Every delay, every unanswered prayer, every closed door has not been wasted. God has been working quietly, preparing you for what you could not yet see. The season that tested you is also the season that shaped you. The impossible that once frightened you now becomes the place where faith is proven. Not because you became stronger, but because you learned where true strength comes from. God has carried you farther than you realize, sustained you longer than you expected, and protected you more than you can see. Even in moments when you felt alone, His presence never left. Peace is no longer something you chase. It is something you receive. Not because everything is resolved, but because your heart is anchored. You may not know how God will move, but you know who He is. That knowledge steadies the soul. It allows you to rest while you wait and to hope without demanding control. As you step forward, the past no longer has authority over you. Guilt has been forgiven. Fear has been confronted. Control has been released. What remains is trust. A quiet, resilient trust that believes God is faithful even when the path ahead is unclear. This trust does not depend on circumstances. It depends on God's unchanging character. The future may still hold questions, but it no longer holds power over your peace. You are not walking into uncertainty alone. God goes before you, walks beside you, and surrounds you with grace. The same God who sustained you in the struggle will guide you in the victory. So take this moment and release what your heart has been gripping. Not because you have all the answers, but because you trust the one who does. The impossible is no longer your burden to carry. It belongs to God. And in His hands, what once felt overwhelming becomes a testimony of faith, hope, and redemption.